I think we're at a crisis moment. And if we don't figure that out, I think we're going to be in a really difficult spot.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest. Hey, thanks for joining us for this brand new podcast called Jesus in the Upper Left. It's a podcast about gospel multiplication in the Northwest, and we are here in Portland, Oregon, USA. And joined with me is Oshua Hawthorne from Brilliance Labs and Rick McKinley from Imago Dei Community, and I'm Gabe Kolstad from Westside Community Church. We're really excited to dive into a conversation, really a 4-week series on context and why it matters so much to the gospel and to multiplying the gospel in any city. And so we're going to jump into some hard-hitting stuff with Rick. And, if anybody knows about the importance of this conversation, Rick, it would be you, right? I mean, you've been such a leader in our city, such a catalyst in church planting and, all sorts of different gospel multiplication. We're excited to have you here for sure.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about why, this conversation, how can understanding the history, of our city help us to be faithful witnesses in our context? So let's kick that around for a minute.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think when, people don't think about the history, or particularly a spiritual history, but oftentimes they don't realize they bring a history. They bring their own understanding of what they think the past was. And Portland's unique, I think, in the sense that there isn't really a religious history. There's some moments like 1905, I think, that there was kind of like a awakening of sorts. But really, people don't have that religious history. That is, back in the day when everyone went to church. So there's not a religious memory. I think that's important. It's really different. Most of the people that get saved at a church have some church background, went as a little kid, had a Catholic upbringing, whatever it is. Because the normal Portlander who's having a spiritual awakening, it wouldn't dawn on them. Like church wouldn't be the place to go to.
Yeah.
So I think knowing the history is important,
Yeah. What do you think, either one of you guys, that informs for us in our activity? How do you take that understanding and then go, okay, let's contextualize that?
Yeah. Well, in the study of anthropology, there's this image or analogy of the cultural onion, and this idea that everyone is like an onion, and there's the things you see on the outside, but you have to peel them off to get to the heart of what's really the core of this culture. And in that idea, right near that core is the experiences that people go through, and experiences not just in the moment, but through the history of those people. And so I think as the church planter coming in, or the pastor trying to think with a missiologist, right? Often we want to just look at, there's cultural forms, okay, they wear plaid and tight jeans. This is what's cool. So I'm going to dress like this and talk like this. And I think too often in church, we deal with forms and think, now I'm contextualized. We don't realize that to get to the core of the worldview, the heart longings, those core elements of a culture, experience and history is far more important than what they wear and fitting in and with whatever the trends are. So I think learning the history and the stories of people and a culture and community really get near the heart of who they are.
Yeah, because we've all seen and done. I mean, I'm probably one of the bigger offenders on this of just going, I think I got it, and then launching something or doing something and realizing, I didn't have it. And, I think there's some collateral damage that happens in that sometimes, depending on who you're dealing with. But if you've gone real public with something that's culturally a misfit, sometimes it takes a long time to recover from that. And you almost have to reinvent again. And that can take a lot of time.
Yeah. And I think in a city like Portland, that with Portlandia, there's these things that stereotype what Portland is. But it creates a false image, a false perception, where I think most cities are part truth. There's a story there. There's a myth there, that's not really true. It's a promise that doesn't pan out. And then there's a deception there, right? In order to have Portlandia, some things had to occur. We had to gentrify. We had to move a bunch of people out. There's these soft zones around Portland with strip clubs and used cars sales, and food deserts where all the poverty is. And that allows Portlandia to be cool. So that's not showing up. Nobody's tuning in going, oh, this is cool. 122nd and Gleason,
right.
And I think when people come, they're like, yeah, I want to plant Portlandia. I don't want to plant in that soft zone. Or I planted in this cool place and I have no idea that all of the black people that lived here got moved out, and then you're like, whoa, I thought like there's a history here. What? And it's like, yeah, it's actually a really bad history. We have an extremely racist past. And so, history is so vital. Yeah. And I think important. I think we all go in not having a clue. Most planners, like we do a demographic study and then we walk around spouting these things like we really know Portland. Portland has 1.9 million people in the greater Portland area, and there's more pets than children. You're like, oh, yeah, that guy's going to kill it.
Okay, one more question for you on this is, what do you think are some of the factors that make, Portland is known, Portland metro area, the Northwest in general, known as, it's a tough place to plant churches. It's a tough place to start a gospel, initiative. What factors do you think make it hard or gospel resistant maybe?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's probably a number of them, but I would say if it's progressive at every level. So what I think we're facing now, the Keep Portland Weird of the 90s, which was, we're going to be on the left as far as left can go. So anything about Christianity that has conservative Christian Judeo ethics, it's always going to push against that. I think that makes it difficult. But I also think the church, most Christians for the last, 100 years, haven't seen any American context as a missionary context. And so they, people still come in and do, preach to the choir, but the choir doesn't live here. And so
that's good.
They're not singing that song. They don't understand that music. They don't know what you're talking about. And you don't, if you're not thinking as a missionary, then you don't understand these kind of windows of redemption and these windows of opposition. So it's either us against Portland, we're going to plant way outside of Portland and be safe from Portland, or, it's kind of the graveyard where we'll take on the forms, we'll drink craft beer and good coffee and make people think we get it. But then you're going to actually bump up against the true agnosticism and relativism and belief systems that make up the ideologies, which are rampant and multiple in Portland. And you realize, well, I don't think I even have a theology of why, heterosexuality is good. I just know it's right,
Mm-hmm.
but is it good and true and beautiful? Or is it just like, don't have sex until you're married, and then you'll get married and then you won't have that much and be frustrated, and the church has just as much divorce as anybody else. And so it's like, we aren't doing that real missionary work and our own self-critical work, I think, to have true engagement.
That's awesome.
Now, Rick, you mentioned the Keep Portland Weird of the 90s. Now that's right around the time that you're starting to plant Imago Dei, and I remember as a young Bible college student going to a church planters gathering that you guys hosted, I think maybe 2003, 2004, and where you're sharing about the work that you guys are doing and launching these different missional communities and teams impacting the city, and really, I think in that season, crafting the vision of what that means to be a church for the city. I'd wonder, could you tell us a little bit of the story of maybe some of those early years, what was going on in the cultural conversation, and just give us some of that history of Imago Dei community.
Yeah. So, I became a believer in Sacramento, Chico, kind of late 80s, came to faith with zero church background, then came to Multnomah 9 months later. So I didn't have a lot of Christian background, but met my wife and got married and had a couple kids, and Portland was really my spiritual home in a sense. We left for a few years, and then we were either going to go back to California or come back to Portland. And so we moved back to Portland in November of 99, and then started trying to gather a core group right after Y2K when the world didn't blow up. But I would say in that time, there wasn't a lot happening in the urban core around church planning. In fact, I remember trying to get, you're trying to get funding and talking to one denominational guy, and he's like, if you go down there, those people are tattooed and pierced, and God can clean them up, but they don't have any money. I was like so angry. And it was true. Like, they are tattooed and pierced and they have no money. And God didn't clean them up. They remained tattooed and pierced. But I would say in those early days, I think being in Portland, the inner east side was pretty gnarly. Like, we planted because of the need that was there. We're, fast forward 20 years and it's like the coolest area of Portland. So it's changed pretty radically. But back then, I think we came in thinking we were going to plant this, big, cool church, and God broke that vision, killed that vision pretty quickly in me. We were really young, started the church with like these 15 college kids that were in a prior youth group of mine. And they started bringing friends, and pretty soon we had like this little basic college group. And they would love to talk about mission and read about mission and think about mission, but not reach out to anybody, not do anything about mission. It was just like this little, mental missionary exercise that we did. And I didn't know what to do. I was just like, okay, I have no idea how to create desire for mission in me and in them, other than to get us like in front of God. And so we met on Sunday nights, and I made this announcement that we're going to meet and repent because we don't love the city every Wednesday night. And I was just like, that's not a way to start a church, but that's what we did. And I would list out like every need I could think of in Portland, and we'd sit around, there'd be 20 people. We weren't going to pray about your relational issues or your girlfriend or whatever. We're going to pray about these things. And it took about 9 months of doing that before there were real like changes in the prayers. People were praying for their neighbor by name. I mean, the great thing is this group was super honest. So the first night it was, God, I don't know if I believe in you. God, I hate my neighbor. God, I remember driving home thinking like, okay, well, I tried to plant a church and that is over now. That ended. But the prayers started to change and they were really authentic. There was real desire there. And so, this couple girls started looking for an apartment complex to give their life to for a year. And that's what they did. And they found this rehab center for single moms who got to keep their kids with them for the year. And they went in there and it was this great like missionary experience. They went in as, cute little Bible college girls, and the women hated them. And they were in tears and like, why don't they like us? And I'm like, well, they're going through rehab. You're holding their kids. They're in sweats with no makeup, like detoxing. And so they just started talking to people who'd been through rehab and figuring it out. And they'd show up in sweats and no makeup with sugar and, coffee and approved sort of addiction related things that Christians are all over. And they learned like cross-cultural missions in a sense. And that just started happening, homeless teens and homeless people. And that was the church. And we just started, that prayer that, if we left, would the city miss us? And I don't know who started it when. Everyone takes credit for that. But we were that's what we were praying back in like 2000. And that really did shape us, we were trying to get in touch with the mayor for years. Like, what are your needs? We want to be here. And eventually we were able to have those conversations to make the city's needs our needs. But, it was slow going, 0 to 50 took 9 months, and just, there were no Bible studies. There was nothing. If you came, you had to like serve. I was so afraid that we'd become a church that wasn't on mission that I didn't want to create small groups or anything. It's like, well, do you guys have Bible studies or small groups? No, you can feed the homeless. You can join this thing. You had to do that. So it was probably a little overboard, but that's kind of how it started.
So there was this book back then that kind of blew up by Don Miller called Blue Like Jazz.
Yes.
And I've heard some theories about its influence and even kind of putting Portland on the map as like the hipster place to come. And he talked about this really edgy emerging church called Imago Dei and all these crazy things and the beat poet and all this stuff that like, I imagine if you were a Christian in somewhere in the South and you heard about it, it sounded like this exotic country that you had to go visit. What was that like for you? And was there kind of like a Blue Like Jazz effect, either an Imago or even you think on the city of Portland and attracting other evangelicals from outside?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Don was part of that original core group. I remember we would drive around. I'm trying to start a church. He's trying to write this book. He finished the book during that core group phase. So really there's only 50 people in the church during that. So, I mean, years later, I'm getting calls from some kid in a dorm room in Tennessee asking if we can get coffee, or literally calling my assistant asking what the weather's like in Portland, you know. But so you figure he writes it that first year, it takes another year to come out, and then it's got a slow burn. So it's like year 5 when it probably takes off. And Imago is at that point, you know, several hundred people. It's a very different season for us. So, and the book is I mean, I just remember him coming being like, hey man, can you sign this thing I wrote about you? You know, I'm like, sure, that's great. But I do remember, you know, people showing up at church because they read Blue Lake Jazz. So it drew people to Imago. They found it. It was like I mean, we never did any advertising, so that was great advertising for Imago. I remember buses of churches coming to see what we were doing.
Wow.
And yeah, it was bizarre. And, you know, they show up and what do we do? Like we have really poorly put together order of service. I get up and preach for a half hour, 40 minutes. We do communion and that's it. And I'm like, I could just picture him taking notes. Okay. There's some announcements, and then there's a sermon.
It was the minor key worship. Those early days.
I
That was the innovation.
There was some really depressing worship songs. We did Good Friday so well, but like getting it to be Easter Sunday was pretty tough for those kids. So yeah, it was. The only thing I think it was probably we were of Portland for Portland, and it had some of that feel to it. But I think it definitely showed the church broadly that there's this new generation of believer that is not, you know, your textbook right-wing Christian. I mean, Don and I are like Gen X. We're like 50 years old now, right? So Gen X is not even a thought in these conversations. It's boomers and millennials and Gen Z. And we're like, hey, remember us? Like latchkey kids, you know, nuclear war, all that. No? Okay. So I think it showed that. I think it definitely created a vibe of like, what is Portland? But I think there's probably bigger forces at play that made like Portland like the dark Portland that we have to go to. It's always been a protest city. You know, it's always been seen politically. The Bushes called it, you know, Little Lebanon or something when they would come here. Like it was, they were not received well. So it's always had that vibe to it. And then I think when 07 hits and now you start to have Facebook and social media, all of a sudden the limelight is much quicker, right? Like everything else, Portland gets a lot more traction. I remember talking to a pastor who was from Orange County, and he came up. We were talking and he's like, man, I could just feel the darkness when I got off the plane. And of course it's like Portland, right?
Like
it's
January,
raining,
probably.
right? Or July or whenever. It's always raining. And he's like, how do you deal with the spiritual darkness? And I know where he's at, like in Newport of Orange County.
Like paradise down there, huh?
Yeah. But I said, you know, if a woman has to inject collagen in her lips or put false things in her breasts to feel okay to go to church, I said, that's dark. It's just a different kind of darkness. And he was like, huh. So I think it's like not seeing our own darkness, that the church just, oh yeah, isn't this great? You know, everyone looks like they're 20 in our church, even though they're like 80 because they've been having work done forever. and that's okay in Orange County. But in Portland, it's spiritually dark all the time. But I do think there's, it's the politics, and then the attention that I think Portland gets, particularly in the last 15 years, makes it more so that it becomes that kind of like, oh my gosh, we have to go reach Portland,
Okay, so you've been here for a long time, and you've been connected to what's been happening around the city, arguably more than anyone else in the city. So you're real aware of what's been happening in different parts of all around town. You've probably seen who knows how many planters come and go, churches stop and start, all of that. When it comes to church planters coming in and doing things, or what patterns have you seen networks, go through in terms of the way they're interacting with, with the mission here? Have you seen things repeated a lot that we can learn from maybe?
I feel like there's a wave. It feels like every few years we get a wave of planters, about every 3 to 5 years.
From outside somewhere.
Yeah. There's a wave of plants that, and we have an 80 to 90% failure rate. So maybe one or two of those stick and then they're gone. That pattern has continued. Part of me is like just glad that God still sends people to Portland. It makes me sad for the planters that there's not more support and networking, and like pre-work done, like to come and live here for a couple of years before you quote unquote plant. We saw this same thing in Salt Lake City, where we planted a church in Salt Lake. Salt Lake's a hard place to plant too, for different reasons. Of course, it's like 50% Mormon. And if you're not Mormon, you don't want anything to do with the church, right? And a wave of church planting took place there. But this church that we helped plant was the only one that remained. But it's taking the time, I think, to go, do I understand this place? And if you're really here to plant a church for the long haul, then taking 2 years to like embed in the culture and understand this place shouldn't be that big of a deal. I think one of the reasons people don't, one of the first things I ask planters is, 5 years in, you've planted the church and it's 120 people. Do you want to stay? And almost every one of them is like, I don't think so, or I'm not sure.
That would feel like a disappointment.
Yeah, I feel like a disappointment.
Wow.
And when you look at the average size of the church is 100 people, right? And yet every planter comes with a dream of planting the mega church, or, whatever it's going to be. So right there, I think if you can't say yes to that, you've already probably put yourself in a very small window of staying, because you got a 90% failure rate, and you've already answered the question, like, I'm not staying unless this thing like is super successful, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Because you've defined success as big and whatever.
So then, okay, there's a couple of patterns there. One, not learning the culture. Maybe two, putting some pretty tight parameters on what success is going to look like way in advance. But let's talk a little bit more about that failure rate and what, on the flip side though, if you go, okay, but if somebody has stuck with it for 10 years, they moved in, they've, whatever has happened, but they're still here, they're still cranking. What do you see informing that? Like, what do you see helping those people stay?
Well, there's a great example of that. Bread and Wine.
Okay.
They came in and they were called Lodge Pole Pine Church, or Lodge Pole Community Church. We don't even have lodgepole pines in Portland, right? But that was the name, and they were doing their thing, and it wasn't working. And to the credit of the planter, he was like, "This is not working." One, he realized we don't have lodgepole pines. Like, I am way out here. I should be like planting in Lapine or something. And sent, like, if I'm remembering right, sent the core team home, like, stayed, figured it out, reconfigured what he was doing, planted a much smaller kind of parish model work. That's when it became Bread and Wine. And eventually handed it off. And, I think the original planter moved home. But that was a case where I remember going, wow, like that's rare, one, but he did it. Like, they sat there, they went, this doesn't work. I didn't learn what I needed to learn. But now that I am here, I'm going to retool everything and plant a church for this city that this city
killer.
Needs.
Yeah, that's killer. And I mean, that's like why we were leaning in together as a community around church planting, is so we could see more of that kind of stuff, because it seems like you probably, one of the other things is that that there's some support in all of that, and some peer learning in all of that. And that's something that we're excited about. And we're seeing a little bit more, in terms of when we watch somebody succeed over the long haul, they've definitely leaned in to peers, to friends and to comrades, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think questioning your forms, questioning the model, questioning those things. I think the challenging part is always there's your resources.
Yeah.
Right. So you got funded by whoever that intended on a certain thing being produced. And Portland just isn't that place, particularly in the urban core. So, if you're getting funded by a bunch of mega churches from the South, and they're telling you, look, here's what you do. You got to do a big mailer, and you got to do this thing for your Easter service, and you're planning urban Portland, like, that's a big waste of money to do a mailer. And people don't go to church because it's Easter. I mean, Christians do, and maybe people with some kind of Christian history, but it's not like all the non-Christians are going to come because you got more parking and a better band. They just don't, right? People don't go to church. So I think there's a implicit tension there. Like, will the people that fund planters to Portland release them as missionaries to create the forms that are needed to reach Portland?
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. I don't know if it's great, because I don't think it's going to happen anytime
soon. I mean, I keep hearing stories of good news in that regard. And it does seem like maybe it's because there's been so much quote unquote failure. I think maybe we could call it learning. There's been so many attempts and then retractions and attempts and retractions that I think networks, even denominations, are looking a little differently at it, because it's true that most cities are moving in the same direction that our city is, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that we're all waking up to, I love that missionary approach, and that is going to require a different thing in different times and places.
Yeah, I really do think so. And I think, at least for us, we've planted like 17 churches over the 23 years in different, that means different things depending on the church. Some it was people and money and staff, and some it's money and relationship and coaching. But the one thing that I think is, like, there's a couple common denominators for the plants that have worked, and most of them have been pretty successful in terms of they're still here, and I would say it's having an assessment that's that's done well. And you know, when we started Acts 29, because I started Acts 29, buried way deep in the Acts 29 history.
I wasn't going to mention it. That church planter conference I went to at your church was an Acts 29 one. I wasn't sure if you were wanted to out yourself. So.
I know. Well, I wasn't going to out myself, but you know, we created an assessment for Acts 29 that was essentially planters assessing planters, which was the dumbest thing in the world, because you had planters that hadn't really planted a church telling somebody else they couldn't plant a church. Just these like arrogant young guys being like, I don't like your haircut. And you know,
that was me. I was a 25-year-old church planter assessor.
Oh, were you really?
Oh yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But like Stadia, Orchards, Church Plain Northwest used to do a great one. And it was this really multidisciplinary assessment, you know, counselors and multiple leader people with teams. And it's pretty thorough. And you come away going like, yeah, am I built for this? And church planners hate it. A lot of them do. But I remember talking to one guy who failed the assessment. I mean, that's a bad word, failed. He didn't assess as a planter, and was trying to deal with the fact that, you know, God called me to go plant. And I remember this conversation about like God also made you, right? Wired you, gave you a temperament and a way of working and being and thinking, and just wouldn't have any of it. And eventually, you know, worked through the cash, and the church, nothing ever even came of it. But then what happens to their marriage and his own relationship with God? Like there's so much there that gets confused because of that lack of submission, you know?
Yeah.
So yes, you can hear from God. I would say that's 25% of the call, but someone else needs to hear from, like someone else needs to tap you on the shoulder and go, yeah, you are gifted and called by God too. You know, we see it in you. We can confirm these things in you. Not to be on a big stage doing this huge thing, but to do this work. And I think that if we took the time to just do that hard work, there'd be so much less sort of just people, you know, laying there at the aftermath of it. Because honestly, resources, I think it doesn't matter. I've seen people with $800,000 not plant the church, you know, plant a small group.
World's most expensive small group.
Right.
Yeah.
And I had a salary for 16 months. That's all we raised to plant Imago, you know? And so I don't think it's about money as much as it is having the right people, you know, men and women that are like, yeah, you're made for this.
Would you say that homegrown assessment and having locals that are here doing the assessment, speaking to that, is really important? Because a lot of these like larger, let's say Southern churches and networks that are coming from the outside, like they're going to have their own robust models and ways that they plant churches in their context. Are you seeing that even those assessment models aren't doing what they're designed to do when they're planted here in Portland?
Yeah, I guess I don't. I would have to see the assessment, right? Like I think we aren't self-critical enough to create our own assessment models. That's what I've noticed in a lot of networks. Like we need an assessment. So we put a few things together, and it's not really the kind of assessment that you're looking for. For instance, one of the people that we put through an assessment who we had embedded, right? So we were all in on this leader. And the assessment came back as a no. And I was like, what? How could, I'm like, and it was, they lead by consensus. And the light went on, because that was all the struggle that we had for 2 years during their embedded process, was them leading by consensus. Like, what do you guys want to do? What do you guys want to do? What do you guys want to do? And like, if you're going to plant a church it's going to be really hard. You're going to have to do some really unpopular things. You're going to make unpopular decisions. You're not going to get to lead by consensus. And that got surfaced, those are the kind of things that I'm like, yeah, we're never going to create an assessment that gets that out. So, but I hear what you're saying. They could like pass a really good, like, Bible Belt assessment, come to Portland, be like, I'm assessed. What I would hope is that assessment creates enough self-awareness in the person that they are missionaries, right? And they would know what they need, know, like, okay, who do I need? What questions do I need to be asking? How do I exegete this culture? How do, what mistakes? And then what do I need to shut up and just listen and learn? And so I would say, yeah, the verdict is out. That's probably 50-50. They might be able to do it. They might not. But I think if we create our own assessment, I would just, if there was like a Portland based, we assess our own, I just would say model it off of some of these others that are really robust in that way. Yeah.
It'd be good to develop like a roll your own church planner kind of Portland model, right?
Yes.
That's great advertising.
Yeah, come on, Gabe. We got that's good branding
that
too.
Is not bad. I think it might fly.
So
roll your own.
Yeah. I have one last kind of question. Maybe this is a tweak, and you can maybe take both sides of this. So we wanted to talk to you about, hey, what advice would you have for a new church planner just getting ready to get started? But it struck me when you mentioned, you said 17 churches you guys have started over the years. So we want to be able to serve church planters as a network, but also the existing church leaders that as they maybe have that desire, that would be great to multiply. That would be great to see more church planting. But, these are all the reasons why I don't think we can do it. We don't have the money for it, or I couldn't convince our board, or we'd lose too many givers. And there's always those reasons / excuses, right, for not doing it. And I'd be curious to hear, what advice would you have for those existing church leaders that are reticent to take the leap and embed a planter or partner with another church to send out funds and members? What have you learned, and what advice do you have for those church leaders?
No, that's a great question. I think too often churches don't think multiply, right? They think divide. They think addition and subtraction, and that if anything like that happened, it would be division, not multiplication. One of the gifts that Jesus gave us in this model of reproduction, right? Make disciples who make disciples, plant churches who plant churches, reproduce leaders who reproduce leaders, is that it forces the church to always be in that discipleship pipeline. So like when we sent pastors and leaders and deacons and elders and, givers and all those things, when we embedded this guy who went to Salt Lake City, I realized I can't tell anyone to leave Imago and go to a church plant, because everyone comes voluntarily and gives voluntarily and all that. Church planters will come and go like, why don't you give me 100 people? I'm like, I don't own 100 people. I don't own anyone. But if they embed, we can give them lots of influence, right? Like give them the pulpit, give them space, put them up front, let them attract. And then anyone that you attract is yours, right? So he started a home community, then reproduced the home community, get these leaders. And then he comes and says, hey, I think it's Salt Lake. I think that's where I'm planting. I'm like, wow, Salt Lake. But he grew up Mormon. It was a good fit. 40 people left, moved, families, quit jobs. I was like, this is insane, right? But they did. He took them. Man, we celebrated that, right? The church is so fired up that like we're sending these people out and they're getting jobs and selling homes and doing this thing. It was one of the most exciting things ever. Now there's grief that happens, right? There's all that stuff. And you just start flipping open Acts and you're like, yeah, look, they're sad that Paul's leaving. And they're like, we're living this mission in real time. We're not building an empire. We're displaying a kingdom that's moving and breaking in. And so I think capturing, like, if you want your people to get out of like a Bible study cul-de-sac where it's just go to this small group and then go to the next one and go to the next one, but actually be part of a process that gets rid of all your leaders and makes room for new ones to step up, then you have to be planting. And it's, I don't know, it's not yours. Like the church isn't yours. The thing I feel like God told us early on was like, give it all away. Like it wasn't yours to begin with. It's not yours to hold on to. It's his. And so to hold it with open hands, like obviously if it's some heretic, I'm not going to be like, yeah, why don't you preach Sunday? There's a vetting process. But if it's a church planner, like we have a guy that's embedded right now and giving him the pulpit and people are cheering him on and then he does his core group thing. And, it's like, gosh, let's pour gas on that, and so I would say it unsticks a lot of your people and gets them involved in God's mission. So it's a really good thing to do.
You can write a book, Unsticky Teams.
Unsticky Teams.
Launching people out. Yeah.
Hey, Rick, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's solid gold, man. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ashua. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to encourage you to subscribe and share, and then also to get on over to our bonus content at togetherpdx.com/multiply.